The United Nations General Assembly meets to debate next week. Crises including the Gaza genocide, Ukraine war and climate change are placing the world body under severe scrutiny, facing pressure from the Trump administration too. What role can the gathering of world nations play? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. It is the 80th birthday of the United Nations, but celebration will be far from the minds of many delegates gathering in New York at the UN General Assembly. Genocide in Gaza, war in Ukraine, conflicts in Africa and a more volatile geopolitical climate will shape many of next week's debates. Recognition of a Palestinian state by long-term allies of Israel would mark the pages of history. The gathering of nations comes as the UN faces its own crises too. Paralysed by vetoes at the Security Council, it's been criticised for inaction on Gaza and Ukraine. Direct attacks from the Trump administration, including funding cuts, have hit the UN hard. All that as US relations with many countries are in upheaval too, with tariffs and threats and once firm alliances now under question. So, could all this give new importance to this year's UN General Assembly? And what would the gathering mean for the future of the United Nations? We'll speak to our guests shortly. But first, this report from Beacháin.
UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres rings the UN peace bell, a symbol of hope for peace. Leading UN representatives joined him as he called for action to, in his words, silence the guns.
8 years ago, the United Nations emerged from the ashes of war to pursue the cause of peace. That mission is the beating heart of our organization. But today, peace is under siege. Conflicts are multiplying. Civilians are suffering. Human rights and international law are being trampled.
The UN will host world leaders for its annual General Assembly later this month, under the theme Better Together, at a time when conflict is rife around the world. The General Assembly is the main debate and policy-making body of the UN. It's the only forum in the organisation where all 193 members are represented. Palestine and the Holy See, the diplomatic representative of the Roman Catholic Church, have observer status. The Assembly also approves the UN's annual budget, and it's under attack from its main funder. A few weeks after taking office again in January, US President Donald Trump criticized the effectiveness of the organization.
There are great hopes for it, but it's not being well run, to be honest, and they're not doing the job. A lot of these conflicts that we're working on should be settled, or at least we should have some help in settling them. We never seem to get help. That should be the primary purpose of the UN.
But critics say there's paralysis in one of the organization's key decision-making bodies. The 5 permanent member states of the UN Security Council, the US, France, China, Russia, and the UK, can veto decisions. The US has repeatedly vetoed UN Security Council resolutions demanding an immediate and unconditional ceasefire in Gaza. Many countries are looking to the UN for stronger and more decisive action on issues such as Israel's war on Gaza, which has killed more than 64,000 people during the past 23 months. International momentum is building in support of Palestinian statehood. On September the 12th, members of the General Assembly voted overwhelmingly in favour of a declaration calling for tangible steps towards a two-state solution. 142 supported the declaration, with 10 voting against and 12 abstaining.
Is adopted.
The General Assembly's President, Annalena Baerbock, has called casting doubt on the UN's role cynical and irresponsible. To prove she's right, both supporters and critics will likely be looking for the General Assembly to display its relevance and purpose when it meets in the coming days. I'm Beacháin, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. us. Donnacha Beacháin is Professor of International Relations at Dublin City University. He joins us from Brussels. Shahd Hammouri is a lecturer in international law at the University of Kent. She joins us from Canterbury in the UK. And Hugh Lovatt is Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He joins us from London. A warm welcome to you all. Donnacha, let's start with you. The UN's leadership will no doubt seek to strike a celebratory tone at the General Assembly as the body marks its 80th birthday. But is there much to celebrate?
Well, as Annalena Baerbock, the new president of the UN General Assembly, said, the UN General Assembly may be at 80 years. That's exceeding the normal human lifespan around the world, but there's very little to celebrate because the UN General Assembly faces in many respects a number of crises which it seems unable to deal with. There's, genocide in Gaza. There's Russia's ongoing full-scale invasion of Ukraine. She mentioned also the problems of women in Afghanistan, the climate emergency. Some of these problems have been going on for many years. Some of them are relatively new vintage. But the UN's inability to be not overcome by geopolitical alignments is an ongoing crisis that you might say goes back to the Cold War. But there seems to be certainly a renewed interest in reforming the UN. Certainly that was the import of her speech. There's reference to this pact for the future, for example. But there's been talk about this before, and all these plans for reforming the UN traditionally have been great in ambition, but rather short on detail and in timeframes.
But Donnacha, what would it take to reform the UN? How easy or difficult would that be?
Well, it would be very difficult. In many ways, the problems mirror those of the European Union. I'm speaking to you here in Brussels, and the European Union finds it very hard to act as a geopolitical actor because you need a unanimity, you need a consensus, and you only need one country to deviate from that consensus, and you're paralyzed. Similarly, the UN Security Council, over and over again, has had the agreement of all members of the UN Security Council, bar often it is the United States when it comes to issues relating to Palestine, and that has paralysed the institution. And then there's the issue of membership, of course, as well. I mean, in many ways, the composition of the UN Security Council is an anachronism. It's frozen the victory or the victorious powers of World War II. So you have, France and France and the United Kingdom on the Security Council. You don't have Germany or Japan or Brazil or India, for that matter. So it's not representative of world opinion. And of course, there are also the issues as well about the trend in global politics. I think that's worth emphasizing, that there's been a general trend away from democracy, I think, globally, and towards a more authoritarian form of governance. That's reflected not only, of course, in traditional dictatorships, but also in the rise in authoritarianism within Europe, within America, of course. And that's a big challenge when trying to reach consensus at the United Nations as well.
Shahd, in his first term, Donald Trump withdrew the US from the Paris Climate Accord, the World Health Organization, the UN Human Rights Council. President Biden reversed that, only for Trump to withdraw the US again when he returned to the White House in January. The US, though, is still the largest funder of the UN, but Trump has made widespread cuts to foreign aid, including to many UN agencies. How much damage has that done to the organisation and its work? Can the UN afford to do the work that it's supposed to do?
Well, what the United States of America is currently doing is coercing the United Nations into its own will. When Donald Trump says that the United Nations is not doing what it's meant to do, it's not doing what serves the U.S. best interest. So it is a way to dismantle this liberal system of the rule of law into coercion and into stopping it. And the reality is, of course, the United Nations is feeling it, and very deeply. For example, if you go to their Geneva office, they don't turn on the escalators to tell you that they have a financial crisis going forward and that they are unable to maintain their very high salary and budgets. However, while this does signal a crisis in the system, perhaps it does signal an opportunity of a change in the system. Nothing in upholding international peace and security demands that the system remains centralized within the number one perpetrator of international law, which is the United States of America. The United Nations could take a decision to change its location somewhere else where the costs of running it are much lower and where other states can contribute more into the budget as well as more effectively. As we speak now, Palestinian delegations haven't been able to make it to New York, and the US has used every single possible card in order to legitimize and stop any form of meaningful participation, not only by Palestine, but also by other states of the global south. So this moment does really pose an existential question to the United Nations as well as the whole international legal system. Is this system premised on the idea that international peace and security is serving the status quo, i.e. whatever is in the interest of NATO states and the overall power struggle between imperial powers, or is this a system that seeks to uphold international peace and security premised on equality and evading systems of domination and subjugation? What we're hoping is that this perhaps might be a moment of reckoning, but sadly enough, the President of the General Assembly that we see now herself is guilty of incitement on genocide, is not perhaps the best person to lead such a swift. So perhaps the United Nations will see a very strong downfall before we see it come back and what we hope to be a strong comeback with the leadership of the global south.
You raise some excellent issues there, which we'll come back to in a few minutes, Shahd. Hugh, what's the Trump administration's beef with the United Nations? Is it actively trying to disrupt the work of the United Nations? As NPR in the US said in a recent piece, can the UN survive the Trump administration?
The Trump administration's issue with the UN, I think, is multifaceted. Firstly, it is about, the identity of the international order. The United Nations was created in part through US leadership and was supposed to embody not just an international order, but a liberal international order, and also, to a certain extent, a vision of US interventionism to varying extents. I think this is clearly not where the Trump administration is. Whether the Trump administration is liberal or not, I think can certainly be questioned. The Trump administration has also made it clear that despite Trump claiming he wants to reassert US leadership, in practice this is about US retrenchment and US isolationism. But also more practically, it is clear that the Trump administration does not really believe in multilateralism. It believes in making deals bilaterally between world leaders, between Trump and other leaders. So ultimately, I think these are some of the core components of sort of the Trump's increasingly hostile and aggressive relationship with the UN. But as has previously been said, this is ultimately about the US wanting the UN to do its own bidding, and that clearly cannot happen because of the composition of the United Nations Security Council, but also because the Trump administration is increasingly at odds with a lot of world opinion, especially when it comes to what's happening in Gaza and the Middle East.
Donnacha, genocide in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, conflicts in Africa, climate change, the more volatile geopolitical climate, all set to hang over the General Assembly this week. But to what extent will Israel's war on Gaza dominate proceedings this year?
I think they will dominate to a large extent because of the scale of the casualties, the geographical location, the interest of so many countries in the fate of Palestine. It has to remember that 3/4 of the UN member states recognize Palestine, and that's only increasing in number. There are a number of states, such as France and Belgium, from where I'm speaking now, which have stated their impending decision to recognize Palestine. So what happens in Palestine matters, and to see a genocide occurring in real time really shakes the conscience of world opinion, and to see the United Nations helpless as a bystander very much undermines the United Nations authority, because in many respects the reputation of the United Nations depends on two main things, really, I guess. It's inclusiveness, the fact that all recognized states of the world are included in the UN, so it's very representative and inclusive, but also it's a norm setter. And when it sees the UN Security Council unable to intervene in what's happening in Gaza and in Palestine more generally, it fundamentally undermines the UN's raison d'etre, which was to regulate conflict, to prevent end conflict, to give a forum for people to deliberate. But when you have parties who are clearly acting in bad faith, and I'm echoing here the words of my predecessor, who, Donald Trump has made it clear that he's a revisionist when it comes to world affairs. He doesn't respect international law. He sees it as an American first type of agenda. And he said that in all sorts of ways, about reclaiming Panama, annexing Greenland from Denmark, making Canada the 51st state. In many respects, he echoes that kind of revisionist, expansionist rhetoric that we associate with people like Vladimir Putin.
Shahd, as Donnacha said, several countries are expected to recognise a Palestinian state at the General Assembly, including Security Council permanent member France, the first G7 nation to do so. How significant is that? And the state of Palestine has full observer status at the UN right now. What would it take to recognise Palestine as a full member? Do you think that there might be an attempt to make that happen at the General Assembly?
So the recognition of the state of Palestine, though I would argue shouldn't be the priority at the moment, the priority ought to be ending the genocide, has more, let's say, geopolitical outcomes rather than legal outcomes, in the sense that it demonstrates and it signals a fracture among the position of economically advanced states and the G7. And it demonstrates a change whereby the European Union is no longer able to uphold face in relation to the insane and sadistic violations by Israel. So there is that fracture that we see, and it's good going forward. It means that we're able to harness it strategically to bring about the end of the genocide. And as to its effects, or whether we see it go full-fledged, the main problem here is whether or not the opportunity in front of us to push for sanctions against Israel, as well as protective presence in Gaza, might be discarded for the sake of this statehood bid, which seems to be what the European Union favors, which is one way of giving Israel a way out, whereby it gives it halfway without actual sanctions and without taking full-fledged a step forward into isolating it on the international sphere. So there is a possibility that that vote might go forward. I have been promised on and on again that this will not be the priority. But if it happens, that will mean that Palestine will have a larger capacity in lobbying and taking things forward. Whether or not that really serves Palestinians and the right of self-determination is a very big question. As we all know, there is very big questions in relation to the representation of the Palestinian people and the genuine nature of the leadership of the Palestinian Authority. As we speak, a lot of the diplomatic channels in front of people who are seeking to take forward civil society positions are completely, absolutely closed.
Hugh, could there be proposals to enlarge the Security Council's permanent membership during this General Assembly and perhaps do away with the veto? I mean, if there was a move by the General Assembly to make Palestine a permanent member, as I understand it, it could be vetoed by the Security Council. That would obviously frustrate a lot of people. I think there is a lot of frustration anyway with the Security Council and the power of the veto. But might that happen this week?
I mean, there might be a proposal, but the actual question is, would that go anywhere? And the subject of UN Security Council reform, as you say, has been around for quite some time and has been growing louder, of course, for the reasons we've just been talking about. But I think it's extremely difficult to imagine the UN Security Council itself accepting any real reform. And I think this is an issue where you would imagine the Trump administration and other P5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, potentially lobbying quite hard UN General Assembly members to not move forward this reform, because obviously more members on the council means diluting potentially the influence of the permanent members. Let's be clear, it could also create other complications, if, depending on the rules of the UN Security Council, but if those new members are also given veto rights, that could potentially create further complications to actually be able to pass through resolutions. It's complicated enough because of 5 potential vetoes. It could become even more difficult. And then, of course, you'd have to then think who would be those candidates. And certainly many countries would be quite happy to be offered a position on the UN Security Council. So then we'd have to go through that whole deliberation, whether it would be Brazil, South Africa, or Germany. So I think, to finally answer your question, I think the details are still very much to be decided, and I don't see that sort of broad political support currently there to push things through, given the difficulties.
Donnacha, what's your view on that?
Well, I think the stakes are very high because we have to look at the precedent, of course. The League of Nations is the predecessor of the United Nations. It was, of course, far less representative and inclusive than the current United Nations. But when it wasn't able to do its fundamental work of regulating conflict and mediating and preventing conflict from occurring and punishing and enforcing those who deviated from international law, essentially powers took states took power into their own hands, and we saw the consequences with World War II. We saw this last week that Donald Tusk was saying that Poland, for example, is closer to conflict than at any time since World War II. So the problem, as was said, with implementing reforms within the UN is that you have to do it within the existing framework and the existing rules, and that requires people to give up their vetoes, to give up their exclusive privilege of being on the UN Security Council, and that's very difficult to envisage. So we are at a critical juncture, really, where the UN either finds a way of reforming itself or risks, moving into the periphery of irrelevance or worse.
Shahd, I want to pick up on what you were saying a few moments ago about moving the UN away from the United States. The Trump administration has denied entry visas to Palestinian delegates for the General Assembly, contrary to the 1947 US UN headquarters agreement, which requires the US to provide unfettered access to UN proceedings regardless of bilateral disputes. Why wasn't this year's General Assembly moved to Geneva as it was in 1988 when the US under President Reagan denied PLO leader Yasser Arafat a visa?
Well, I believe we are still in a diplomatic freeze, so to speak. All states are quite very much afraid of taking anything forward, including the United Nations itself, which is stuck in a freeze. If it seeks to do anything against US will, then it risks losing hundreds of millions in funding. The same goes for states. What I understand is that there's a lot of frustration against the United States, but that there's a problem in forming a unified position that seeks to take that forward. And the question is whether or not states are willing to pay the price when it comes to defending Palestine. And of course, what we are trying to say is if this happens today to the Palestinian delegation, it could happen tomorrow to any other delegation that the US is not pleased with. And the US hasn't only barred the Palestinian delegation, but also Palestinian civil society, which means that there are no effective means to engage with states or brief states and do all of the background work in order to fortify a decision that seeks to end this genocide. So the question is whether the United Nations will wait until it all crashes, or as noted, it would fall into ambivalence before it takes a step. Or will it take things decisively now? The whispers that I hear are that there are no moves towards radical decision-making. Everyone that I speak to within those circles seems to provide very conservative answers as to the path forward, and the main justification that they give for it is fear of US tariffs, US sanctions, or otherwise. And unless states take unified position in order to call things by their name, which in this case is economic coercion and economic duress, and to capture that in its fullness, and to say that that indeed is an offense against self-determination and sovereignty, we have no way forward. And sadly enough, it seems that things need to get way much worse before things happen. We would have anticipated that the mood would be very different at the General Assembly, but sadly enough, we haven't heard much until now. But who knows? We are walking blind without the capacity to be there.
Hugh, we're rapidly running out of time, but I just want to ask you a question about the ICC rather, and the US's non-recognition of it. It's sanctioning members of the court as well, along with other members of the United Nations. What impact does that non-recognition have, the sanctioning of members of the court, have on the UN's ability to promote accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity?
Well, of course, this is not just about the ICC, and it's also about the ICJ, which last summer gave its own advisory opinion on the illegality of Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories. And so clearly the US sanctioning of the ICC itself is extremely damaging to the international order. But so is the unwillingness of many other countries, and let's be clear, many of them Western European countries, to also follow ICC, to enforce ICC arrest warrants, but also to apply the opinion of the International Court of Justice. So this is an issue not just with American leadership or lack thereof, and American illiberalism, and issues to do with the United Nations itself. I think this is a much broader issue about the collapse of the international liberal order itself. And I think we need to recognize, well, that has been driven by the actions of others, of Russia, China, Israel, etc. It is the inability and unwillingness of the US and Europe to defend that order, which is really putting us in this current predicament.
Okay, Donnacha, we've been pretty negative so far. Let's try and end on a positive note. To what extent could this year's General Assembly be marked by efforts by traditionally marginalised countries to take on a bigger role at the UN? To what extent are global South countries not seeing this at the moment as a crisis of multilateralism, but as an opportunity to remake the system of global governance to suit their needs, perhaps?
Well, look, I mean, it was said once that democracy was the worst form of government except for the alternatives. You could say the same about the United Nations. In many respects, it's the worst type of international organisation except for the alternatives. It brings countries together in an unprecedented forum. It gives a voice to countries as small as places like Tuvalu and Nauru with populations of just 10 or 11,000 people. And in theory, they have a vote in the General Assembly, which is the same as that of the United States. It's one vote for each member state. So there is always that opportunity that they can act collectively, that they can, when they go to the United Nations, is of course they can get visas, they can form alliances, they can get their point heard. And that is a unique opportunity for the smaller countries, because the bigger countries, they can project their power irrespective of what they do with the United Nations. But it does provide an unparalleled forum for smaller countries and smaller states to get their point across, and as I said, to form alliances which collectively then can transcend those divisions and perhaps make some bigger impact in global politics.
Very briefly, Shahd, we've got about 30 seconds. Do you agree with that?
Well, I agree, and I think there is movement, especially with the states that have signed the Bogota Declaration. So we are looking towards further multilateralism. CARICOM is changing its position. So little by little, we are seeing states of the Global South rise up and make concrete decisions. And we hope to see that form of work start when it comes to Palestine, pushing for protective presence and sanctions. And we are seeing a very big rise. So we hope that their voices will be much more unified going forward.
And there we have to end it. Many thanks indeed. Donnacha Beacháin, Shahd Hammouri and Hugh Lovatt. Thanks for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website. You'll find that at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X, our handle there at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here, thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.